I'm Cortana.
My name is Alexa.
I'm your Google Assistant.
Researchers at Google used an algorithm to analyze eye scans as a method for predicting heart disease.
The Amazon Go market uses artificial intelligence to monitor what you've reached for on the shelf.
In many circumstances, AI is already as biased as humans.
Amazon software engineers recently uncovered a big problem. Their new online recruiting tool did not like women.
The algorithm is always going to augment the system that it's in, and if the system itself is biased, is unjust, then the algorithm is going to replicate that.
Hello, women in the world.
Hello.
I am Elaine Welteroth, and I am here with three women who are leading the conversation of the future of ethics in artificial intelligence. So please give a warm welcome to Laura Gómez, Toni Townes-Whitley, and Joy Buolamwini. All right, we have a very complex issue to break down in 23 minutes, so I'm going to dive right in. Toni, let's start with some terminology.
Okay.
Most of us have a general sense of AI. We think of it as the technology that powers the little robot assistants in all of our smartphones, so Siri or Alexa. But the reality is AI is much more ubiquitous than that, right?
It absolutely is. I mean, I think we could look at it from assisted intelligence, which most people are used to, some form of bot or some capability that helps in our existing tasks. And then we also have this conversation around augmented intelligence, which takes a task and the artificial intelligence now expands what you can do in the human domain and hopefully unlocks human potential is the goal. And then fully autonomous intelligence, which is where we've heard conversations on autonomous driving and other examples where the machine itself, the computer itself, or the AI capability itself is there without human intervention. And it's really across the spectrum of assisted, autonomous, and augmented that we're having a conversation around AI and what it means for women and people of color around the world.
What would you say are some of the less expected ways that AI affects us today and into the future?
You know, we think about AI, and I think a lot of our conversation and what sort of connects us here on the stage is there's a great power that AI can bring, and we've seen that in terms of being able to take large data sets, large pieces of information, and allow for this very, very fast and rapid analytics on machine learning and big data so that the human itself, the human role, the human job or task can move up the value chain. That is the goal of AI in terms of generally the designer. That AI does the more, if you will, routine task, can help with decision analytics and help support, but that the human task actually moves up to higher value-added capabilities. So we can do things that took us, if you will, in clinical trials, months and years now in minutes and moments and days. All of that's the upside of the AI. The flip side is the same technology that can empower can also divide and is dividing and is not necessarily inclusive of all of us. And so we talk about AI in terms of the other aspects of AI. Facial recognition is one that is probably most noted. It is where does that create a set of possible consequences? Consequences around human rights, consequences around the denial of services. When the algorithms are being trained by humans who bring their bias, the algorithms also contain a bias. And as computers become more like humans in areas of reading and comprehension, which values do those computers adopt? They adopt the values of the designers of those algorithms, and that's where we see the divisive. I guess the last piece I'd just say is we also think of AI and automation together and the implications on the labor market. And so there's a lot of studies that have been done, and one most recently with the World Economic Forum, that speaks to women being disproportionately impacted by AI and automation over the next decade because we are disproportionately in labor categories that are ripe for automation and displacement. And so if we're not intentional, AI can absolutely divide and further divide the, if you will, the labor force that we have now.
Well, you teed up my next question perfectly. Laura, you are the founder of Atipica, which is an AI recruiting tool that enables blind recruiting. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that means. So we all know that women are severely underrepresented in tech, but I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how AI has actually been contributing to this problem through perpetuating certain hiring biases.
Definitely. So one of the things that we don't understand and that people outside of Silicon Valley, I grew up there, is that people don't look like this panel that are funding these companies for AI. For example, the capital goes towards a young white male. He funds his company, his startup, sells it to Facebook or Google, and then when he exits, he goes and starts a company based on drones. And drones are another part of AI where it uses the images to actually predict. So the drone that this young founder did actually ended up working with ICE. So we think why I am so passionate, and the other women from Project Include, on why inclusion is so important in this conversation, is that we as women will build more inclusive AI. We won't replicate the biases that our male counterparts have. I remember a couple years ago, I was selling our tool, and then they said, well, we can build this internally. And this company actually ended up building it internally, and their algorithm ended up discriminating against women, and women that had women, they had a women college, because their team ended up being data scientists that were all male. So I think it's really important that more women are in the conversations, more women of color are in the conversations, because this directly impacts us. There are algorithms of oppression, of gradual, systematic exclusion on the future of how we're going to hire and how we're going to build the workforce.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to give a little disclaimer because the imagery you're about to look at might be a little triggering. And Joy, I'm going to kick it to you to break down what we're going to see. It's very clearly a facial recognition fail on a very large scale. So Joy, you've done a lot of work in facial recognition. Explain to us, what are we looking at? Why does this happen? And how does this happen?
So I am a computer scientist, and I'm also a poet. And at MIT, my thesis focused on facial analysis and gender classification. And what my research showed was that from large tech companies like the ones you're seeing, there was male bias, and there was also white bias in terms of the accuracy of these systems. So when it came to gender classification, you had error rates of no more than 1% for lighter skinned men. And when it came to darker skinned women, you had error rates as high as 35%. And because darkest skinned women were the worst performing group, I decided to write a poem about it called AI Ain't I a Woman, where I posed Sojourner Truth's 19th century question that Oprah asked yesterday to 21st century algorithms. And you can see that the answer was not quite yes. And so one of the poem lines is, can machines ever see my queens as I view them? Can machines ever see our grandmothers as we knew them? Michelle Obama, unabashed and unafraid to wear her crown of history, yet her crown seems a mystery to systems unsure of her hair. So here you have Microsoft, right, asking, is this a hairpiece? We also have IBM describing it as a toupee. Oprah Winfrey, even for her face well known, some algorithms falter, echoing sentiments that strong women are men. And this is Amazon that's currently selling this kind of technology to law enforcement right now, currently selling this technology to the FBI, currently up for a $10 billion bid with the Department of Defense for Project Jedi, right? But we laugh, celebrating the successes of our sisters with Serena smiles. So here you see Serena Williams, and this is IBM Watson labeling her as male. And I end that poem with, no label is worthy worthy of our beauty, because at the end of the day, it's not about labels, it's about having agency to determine who we are.
Whew. I just want to shout out that Joy was described to me as a poet of code and as a digital activist. And I just hope one day I have a little girl who grows up to be just like you. All right, Toni, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about some of the stumbles that Microsoft has had as it relates to AI, and what were some of the lessons that you learned from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Joy characterized it correctly. This idea that algorithms are trained, algorithms reflect those of those who develop the algorithm, and when you have these sort of continuum between where we have a higher percentage for people who look like the developer and a lower percentage for those who don't look like the developer, it's more of a conversation on how do we diversify the development community. The design side of tech has to look more like those who consume tech than just a small bubble that exists within white males. You know, at Microsoft, and I would argue across the tech industry, we have tried to push the barrier on how far we can learn in our research on AI. We started with some bots. Many of us know that as we were working with bots, we found out very quickly how bots would learn from the internet. They learned the good and they learned the bad. They learned how to actually extend sort of racial epithets and racial negative slurs. The bots became very similar to what we heard in different parts of the internet. And so without intervention, without acknowledgement, and without rethinking our initial construct, we would again be proliferating or perpetuating the very bias that exists around us. It comes back to this conversation. So look, we're learning. I said to Joy in the green room before we came out, I think everyone on my team has memorized Joy's Coded Gaze TED Talk, her first. And we're not all poets, and you really don't want all of Microsoft attempting to rhyme. That's not a good, probably not a good thing for us. But we can understand the implications of what it is to get more women in the design phase, more people of color, but even beyond that, the implications of how AI can be used and misused. It's almost like a warranty discussion. How was it designed? Is it being used to its design? If not, what are the penalties? Who can enforce those penalties? So I sit on an AI ethics committee that reports to our CEO. And every few weeks, we're going through how have we designed against the sensitive uses of this particular technology. Is the technology mature enough? Will it capture all of the images? Will it have a consequence in terms of physical harm or infringement of human rights? Should we stop now? Should we put more of a warranty clause underneath it? How diverse was the team that designed it? How diverse is the team that's going to use it? Do we have responsible individuals in place? This is where tech has outpaced the rule of law and, quite frankly, the formulation of policy. And all of those are catching up to what we can do in technology.
Joy, I want to talk to you about consent in AI.
Yes.
Because a lot of us aren't even aware when we're interacting with AI technology. For example, when you're applying for a job online, right? So what ethical issues does this raise? Can you break that down a little?
Absolutely. Having agency, having affirmative consent is a major issue, because right now AI is infiltrating our lives in ways we're not even aware. So with the Algorithmic Justice League, we have bias in the wild stories that are submitted. So here's a hiring example that we got not too long ago, which is there's a company called HireVue. And they use video analytics where they say we can infer verbal and nonverbal cues to make inferences about things like your problem-solving approach. And here's the kicker. We train on the current top-performing employees in your company. So I wrote a New York Times op-ed saying I was worried. I've done some research. When you have pale-male data sets or highly skewed data, you can have some issues where you replicate past hiring issues with these systems. But what really struck me about this particular submission is that the people who submitted this bias in the wild story told me they didn't learn until afterwards that AI from HireVue was even being used in the process to begin with. Facebook, people saw the 10-year challenge hashtag, and I'm thinking, have you thought about the last 10 years where we've been providing tags to images that Facebook has used to develop their facial recognition systems? So even though you're using these platforms, you might not know what's happening with that data, or it might end up being used elsewhere. So Facebook has a patent that says, okay, if you go to a retail shop, because we have all of your face prints, think of your fingerprints, now you have face prints, your biometric information. When you go into a shop, we can identify you and then give the information of your likes and preferences. Where is the consent? So if we don't have any kind of consent with how these systems are being used, we're really being robbed of choice. So that's a major issue. But another thing I wanted to talk about are both the cost of inclusion and the cost of exclusion, because we've been saying we need more diversity within who's creating AI and so forth. And even if we make systems more inclusive, right, they can nonetheless be weaponized. So think of putting facial recognition on lethal autonomous weapons, drones, guns, facial recognition. Even if it's accurate, it might not be the world you want to live in. So in that case, you might say, exclude me from the system. There's a study that came out of Georgia Tech that showed for self-driving car technology for pedestrian tracking using computer vision, that the systems were less accurate at detecting people with darker skin than lighter skin, right? So there's a cost of exclusion. So it's not so easy to say, have me in the system or don't have me in the system.
And to just touch upon that, since I am in the hiring space, since I have founded a company based around inclusive AI, I have also been on these panels with all of these male founders that are making bots to hire. So for example, you don't know that sometimes when you're applying for a job and then they want to reply to an email, there may be a bot. And once you get on the phone, it could be a bot. And they don't understand the implications that that has on the workforce. They don't understand that they're gathering this data based upon a data set that's actually excluding the large majority of the population. And so when I talk to them and I'm speaking on panels with these men, they don't see, I have been on a panel where a man told me at the LinkedIn conference that AI is not biased. And I said, but you are, correct?
Right.
And so it starts those conversations. It's very concerning to me as a founder, concerning to, as I see this future, not just of tech, AI, drones, cryptocurrencies, and they're all mostly male. I spoke at the largest conference for AI in December, and the name of that conference, when I was approached, was called NIPS. And it was until the woman that started in the research and, changed it to NeurIPS, and they wanted me to talk about AI, and I said, who is the audience? And they're like, it's 85% male. So I think it's sort of women and women of color, we tend to speak about this because we know how much it's going to impact us, even though we're the minority in this industry.
And the other component on consent is we have to think about employees. So there's been quite a bit of employee activism. Google presents an interesting case for Project Maven. Project Maven is essentially experiment, well, more than an experiment, it's being used now to see if you could use AI to analyze the drone surveillance footage that was being taken all around the world. And so you're going to do object detection, you're going to do computer vision. That means you can target people and potentially people you might want to kill. So Google employees actually came together and said, we don't want to build this. And you now have a movement called Tech Won't Build This that's going on. I do think, though, that Microsoft ended up picking up Project Maven, and also Microsoft had a $19.4 million contract with ICE, which Microsoft employees also came together to say this is something that we don't want to support. So I'm very curious how you think through employee activism.
This has been, this is where it's not as binary as it would sound, right? The challenge that we have is Microsoft, Google, and all of these companies are global companies. And so we are talking about it sometimes in a geographic and sometimes a bit of a narrow lens. When we talk about privacy and consent, it changes, even the consumerism of that changes based on where you are around the world. We have Western Europe with the GDPR leading the general data privacy and protection, if you will, regulation that's really saying, hey, as a citizen, I want the ability to know where my data is. I want the ability to be forgotten in a system, to be able to audit, and that has moved, if you will, it's moved to the West. And yet, in parts of Asia, I would argue, the high willingness to offer up personal data for various value-added services. In certain industries, we see in automotive, high willingness for consumers to offer up personal data for their car or their automobile to be able to provide them capability. So this is a conversation that we've had around making sure that we listen to employees, that employees have the opportunity to choose which projects they work on in companies, in tech companies. But also be aware that we've still got the US military asking us, how do we learn, how do we understand, how do we do ethics? I have as many military generals asking me, how's your ethical framework? How do you run your ether committee or your ethics committee? How do we build in the trade-offs within the military? If we all exit, then what happens? What do we leave the military on their decision-making capability? What happens if we all exit and other parts of the world that may be, if you will, aggressors that don't have some of the same democratic discussions going on that are also procuring this technology? So I say to this, I say in terms of response, we have a lot to learn on this issue. The one thing that we are absolutely clear on is we don't want technologists making all of these decisions. There is a role for government regulation. Right. There is a role for public sector. There is a role for nonprofit, and there's a role for citizen action in trying to define the scope of what technology companies have for the last decade pretty much been out there scoping on their own.
So absolutely.
What would you say is the government's role and responsibility in all of this? I mean, are there certain specific regulations that we should be pushing for? That's open to anyone on the panel.
I would definitely say we need regulation. We cannot leave it to companies to self-regulate. And one thing that we can commend Microsoft and especially Brad Smith on doing is saying that we need regulation for facial recognition technology. So that has happened, acknowledging that there's a problem. But the type of regulation is really important. So you have large companies that spend tens of millions of dollars on lobbying. And so if you're saying we shouldn't have self-regulation, but you yourselves are then writing the legislation through the lobbyists, then we're not necessarily bringing in all of the voices that need to be here. So an example that's going on right now is legislation that's under review for Washington State. There's legislation that came from civil society, and there's legislation that's more favorable to corporate interests. And at the end of the day, we have to say that a corporation has to put the profits above the people, but we have to think about the public interest long term. So I commend Microsoft for saying, yes, there needs to be legislation, and I hope that there will also be the moral courage to make sure that the critical voices are in the room so that when we say things like affirmative consent, that doesn't just mean you get a notice. It means you actually have the option to opt in or to opt out. It means that there's meaningful transparency. So if Microsoft is providing technology that's then used in China to monitor a Muslim minority, right, that the company takes steps for accountability, that there's continuous oversight. So even if companies say, okay, we can be audited, you can check what we're doing, that we have processes where the people who are most marginalized, the people who are most at risk for the adverse impacts of AI have a say in whether or not it's used.
And really quick, on the employee activism, I've been in tech since I was 17, so almost 20 years of my life. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I was an early Twitter employee. And so going back to employee, like when Travis joined Twitter, I went up to the general counsel and I said, should we have a policy on dictators threatening their citizens on this platform? And I should have been more active and then introduce self-regulation during here, because now the AI that these platforms are using, I actually don't understand hate speech against women, against minorities, against international citizens. And so those are the things that I agree with you, that employee activism will be something that will actually regulate, self-regulate the companies at least somehow.
And I'd like to just say, Stacey brought up this tri-sector, Stacey Abrams earlier about tri-sector. There's a role for private, public sector, nonprofit, and everyone in this room. At some point, we have to get educated. Is there a role for government to play in regulation? Yes, but you got to be an educated consumer and an educated policymaker. Teachers are working with education in classrooms. Go look at Teacher Cert and tell me how much digital training there is even for the teachers who are influencing our students of the future. So at some point, we have to start to all get smarter, and that's why the work of the women on this panel is so phenomenal, but it's got to become absolutely ubiquitous. It's got to become part of the way we understand technology, both what we want to get out of technology, what it can do, as well as the harm that it can provide. And if you look at companies across the tech, we as a tech industry have to come together. That's why I'm excited about the Tech Accord and other things that are bringing tech industries together. We've taken on the Department of Justice 7 times, our own U.S. Department of Justice, on the issue of privacy as a U.S. company, and won 7 times. So if we're going to get real and we're going to be totally transparent about the conversation, look across the tech industry and understand what the different players are doing, engage, and then vote with your feet, your pocketbook, with your vote. Let's make it real across these 3 sectors.
And I would add one last thing, which is that storytelling is crucial.
Yep.
I'm a poet, yes. I'm also a girl who learned how to code, which is how I was able to run these tests. So how can we think about telling stories that make daughters of diasporas dream and sons of privilege pause?
Yeah.
Woo! And on that note, thank you, ladies. We've clearly just scratched the surface of a very complex and nuanced topic, but thank you for sharing your expertise with us today, and thank you all for being a part of the conversation.
Thank you.